Welcome to the Innovation Ecosystem Podcast, where we interview remarkable and thought-provoking guests from the worlds of business, academia, sports, science, and the arts. We firmly believe that while innovation is simple, it is not easy. It requires an open mind. It requires cognitive diversity. It requires curiosity, which is why on this podcast, we explore the subjects of innovation and change from multiple perspectives. We look at topics through different lenses. We hear about how small I innovations can compound over time. We show you how you can exercise your innovation muscles and make you and your organisation more innovative and better able to respond to change. With your host, Mark Bidwell.
Hello, this is Mark Bidwell, and welcome back or welcome to my podcast, where I look at topics of innovation, leadership and culture from multiple perspectives. Now this week I'm thrilled to be joined by Amy Edmondson, who I talked to the day before her fascinating and very important new book, The Fearless Organization, was released. Now Amy is Novartis Professor of Leadership and Management at Harvard. Her work was referred to me by Ed Hess, who kicked off this season of episodes. And last but not least, she's been voted several times onto the list of Thinkers 50, along with previous guests like Alex Osterwalder, Whitney Johnson, and several others. Now, you might recall a couple of years ago, there was lots of buzz on the internet surrounding Project Aristotle, which was Google's multi-year study to find out what really characterizes the very top-performing teams. And they discovered that even the extremely smart, highly powered employees at companies like Google need a psychologically safe work environment in order to fully contribute the talents that they bring to the market. And this study, Project Aristotle, references Amy's work and was a catalyst for her to write this book. And I've always believed, at least at an emotional level, that creating safe spaces for people to explore the unknown is a core leadership skill and fundamental to creating a culture of innovation. And indeed, our executive programs are built on two elements: cognitive diversity and a safe, non-competitive space. And here, competitors can mean internal competitors, such as your peers who might be after your job, as well as competing organizations in the marketplace. And in an earlier episode on museums, guest Wanda Draper talked about museums as being very safe spaces in which to look at the world differently. So I'm really pleased to learn more about the science behind psychological safety, as well as what you as a leader can do right now to exercise this muscle. Now, the good news is that as a leader, even if you feel that your CEO is a pathological tyrant, you can create the conditions in your local work group that are required for innovation, learning, and growth. And by the way, this is not about creating a warm and fuzzy culture that doesn't value performance. On the contrary, a safe culture and outstanding results go hand in hand. And look at companies like Ray Dalio's Bridgewater Capital, or the Eileen Fisher Fashion Company, or Pixar, all of which are profiled in Amy's book. So for anyone who manages knowledge workers, and let's face it, that is, I suspect, the vast majority of you listeners, this is key. Mastery of this leadership skill lets you tap into the full cognitive diversity in your organization and beyond. It gives you a way to think differently about facing down the VUCA challenges that increasingly characterize our work lives. I've said enough. Let's hear what Amy Edmondson's got to say about it. So, Amy, your new book, The Fearless Organization, has just come out, I think.
Yes.
And in the intro, you talk about, how you discovered the concept of psychological safety by mistake. So how did that happen?
I was lucky enough to be a part of a team of medical researchers I was a second-year PhD student. And the goal of this larger project was to measure the prevalence of error in hospitals. And they decided they might as well have someone who knew something about teams on the project. So to answer a very small, specific question, which was, do better teams measured according to a standard team effectiveness instrument make fewer errors? And the rationale for that hypothesis, which of course makes sense on the face of it anyway, was that research in the aviation context had shown that was the case. So they'd shown that pilots with equivalent amounts of sleep or preparation or training in simulators, mind you, not in real flights, but in simulators, were when they found ways to work effectively as a team, they made fewer errors as cockpit crews. So these physicians thought it might be nice to replicate that finding in the healthcare space. So I was asked to play that role. And it seemed like I thought it would be almost an easy research paper. I'd use the survey and I'd have these wonderful independent researchers tracking the error rates, and I'd simply run the correlation. And that's exactly what happened. 6 months of data collection on their side, a day or two on my side early in that process. And lo and behold, there was a correlation. And lo and behold, it was in the wrong direction. So that was sort of startling and a little bit upsetting. I didn't at first know quite what to do because it just seemed so wrong that, the better teams, according to this well-validated instrument, were having more mistakes in their vicinity. So I thought about it, and it suddenly occurred to me that maybe the better teams were more able and willing and kind of thoughtful in being able to talk about error and hence report them and have thoughtful discussions about them, because this is, after all, complex, customized work where any reasonable person will realize things will go wrong. So that became my new idea. Mm-hmm. So I went to the principal investigators, the physicians, and they were far less happy to hear from me than I might have anticipated. I mean, they thought this was just dead wrong because they had been assuming that their measure was absolutely objective and valid. And I was essentially saying it may be biased and systematically biased based on something very squishy, which is people's ability and willingness to speak up and engage in these discussions. So to make a already long story not much longer, I had to hire an independent sort of anthropologist, young researcher, to look at these teams from a very objective perspective, not knowing the hypothesis, not knowing anything about the data, just to see whether there were climate or cultural differences across these teams. And indeed, they were stark. They were quite visible. And so what we ultimately saw was that these small work groups, not really small, but in the dozens, varied substantially in their climate, particularly related to error and speaking up. It wasn't for a couple of years before I labeled that difference psychological safety, but it was palpable and it was stark. And I was able then to show through a variety of different methods that it was extremely predictive. This climate variable was extremely predictive of the error rates. Mm-hmm. And by the way, not at all predictive of sort of random bad things happening. So the beauty of that study was, for me, it was a surprise. It was a turnaround. It was unexpected. I then had to kind of track, and follow up and try to figure out a way to show what might be going on. But ultimately, and I was able to publish the paper, but ultimately it was a surprise finding. It wasn't what the study design was meant to find. So I knew that I had to design a study going forward more rigorously and systematically to show that this difference might exist in other settings. So it was at first a sort of moment of terrible disappointment, almost fear. How am I going to tell my advisor? And then it turned around to be this wonderfully interesting and new idea about the workplace, and especially a workplace where there's uncertainty and interdependence. So that launched a whole lot more research after that.
And much of that is captured in your book, The Fearless Organization, Creating Psychological Safety in the Workplace for Learning, Innovation and Growth. That's the subtitle. So, how do you define, you touched on it, but what's the, your working definition of psychological safety?
Psychological safety is a belief that I can speak up at work with work-relevant content of any kind, no matter how potentially interpersonally threatening. And of course, that includes asking questions, asking for help, talking about mistakes, and offering ideas, maybe even wild ideas, things that I'm not confident will be well respected. Now, all of those things sound like what you would expect people at work to do, especially in the knowledge economy. But what we know about the human being is that we have a very deep interest in looking good, and especially looking good in front of the boss. And there are instinctive responses there. I don't want to ask for help. I don't want to ask a question. It might make me look stupid. So a psychologically safe environment is one in which we find ways to overcome that natural tendency to engage in face saving or self-protection. Self-protection dominates excellence, really. Sometimes my primary goal, but not entirely consciously, is to look good rather than to be good. rather than to do the kinds of things that we need to be great.
And I mean, I think you described this as a group property.
Yes.
Versus trust, which is one to one, and then I guess versus individual fear. I mean, there's almost a hierarchy of this theme, right?
Yes. So there are individual differences, and one well-known individual difference that is related, but is not the same thing, is neuroticism. Right? Some people are simply more neurotic than others, meaning they're simply more likely to think the world isn't a safe place.
Yep.
And yet psychological safety emerges as a group level property, meaning that if you and I work together for a while with some interdependent activities, like in a hospital unit or in a branch bank, we will develop a similar sense of psychological safety simply because of the things that happen around here. So we'll have a similar kind of hypothesis, if you will, about what happens to us when we take interpersonal risks. That nothing bad happens or something bad does happen. So that for that reason, it tends to be very local, right? It's a group of interdependent people in an organization. It's not the organization as a whole.
Right. And we'll come back to this later on. But I mean, this is good news, I guess, for the individual leaders, because it means that they can actually shape, they might be working in an organization dominated by someone who wouldn't be described as creating a safe environment, but nonetheless, they can, within their own work group, they can create their own safe environment for themselves and their colleagues.
They absolutely can. They can, in some sense, they can be a buffer. They can, sometimes you hear in organizations, you hear this described as air cover, although you usually use that phrase with executives at or near the top. But I think any, unit leader or project leader or branch manager can create a wonderfully safe and engaged and energized workspace where they live, where they work.
Okay, let's come back to that later on, because before we get there, I mean, why is it? I mean, we touched on this before we came on air, as it were. But why is this such an important topic in today's kind of VUCA world? And I guess the answer isn't just sort of politics and nationalism. I guess there's a bigger answer there, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think that it's so important in today's world because we know this, but we live in a knowledge economy. We do knowledge work. Okay, we know that. Everybody's heard that. But what does that really mean? And when you start to think deeply about what that means, it means that the most valuable resource we have are things that live inside people's heads. And unless those things are coming out, we're leaving value behind, as it were. So, and in order to do work that is interdependent, meaning you and I have to talk back and forth with each other to do a good job, or uncertain, meaning we don't have a crystal ball on exactly what will work, then, interdependence or uncertainty, let alone both, we've got to be willing to take interpersonal risks. We've got to be willing to ask for help, ask questions, and so on, or we're at risk. We're at risk of things that range from human safety, worker safety, customer, patient safety, to business risk, terrible failures, products that get launched that are no good, and people knew that but were afraid to say so. So it's more important than ever because there's more uncertainty and more interdependence than ever.
Right. Let's get into what unsafe looks like, and then we move to the positive side. So you've got lots of great stories. I mean, maybe we can. And one of the things that I loved here are the taboo topics. The assumptions that you don't speak up if your boss's boss is present. I mean, what are some of the really bad, unsafe environments that you've come across look like?
Well, and I've come across unsafe environments in organizations ranging from hospitals to automotive, and I write about them in the book. So. And some of them are, of course, well known. Like the one that always seems to me to come to mind first these days dominated the headlines a couple of years ago, which was the VW Dieselgate story. And to me, that is a story where I am confident that VW has among the brightest engineers on the planet, and that those engineers figured out at a certain point in the process, and this is well documented now, that these engines could not pass the California emissions tests. And yet, their boss and their boss's boss and so on had made it absolutely clear that they must. But so this is a recipe for failure, right? Like a stretch goal and closed ears.
Yep.
I mean, that's just going to be, because what's going to happen is human fear and interpersonal fear and the sort of almost spontaneous fear of the boss, let alone the boss's boss, will lead me to believe, almost erroneously, that I just have to produce it, even though nature and science say no, right? But I have to do it anyway. So, imagine what must go through the minds of, an engineer or engineers who decide that producing cheating software, is better than speaking up. It almost seems implausible when you describe it that way. And yet that's what happened. So to me, the object lesson here is that interpersonal fear prevents actual news from going up the hierarchy. And then second, it leads to distortions that in fact can make it look like we're doing great work for a while, right? So it in a sense, it just delays the inevitable.
Yep.
And so that was a story of where fear dominated. This was a culture of fear. And we might even be willing to back up and say once upon a time, a culture of fear worked when knowledge was clear, causal relationships were clear. It was absolutely clear what everybody needed to do to get the result we wanted. Then I might as well scare them into doing it and if what you do is utterly transparent, again, then there won't be a big loss. If what the employee has to do can be readily, transparently, objectively assessed, you can get away with fear. But in a VUCA world, as you say, in a knowledge-intensive world, in a world with complex technologies, uncertainty, interdependence, it's a recipe for failure. So in the VW story, we end up with scandal and massive failure, massive loss of business value, and catastrophic embarrassment, really, which I think was the direct result of creating a fear-based culture and or believing that fear is the way to motivate and get excellence.
And I mean, I don't know how many employees Volkswagen has. I mean, probably 250,000, maybe 500,000, but I mean, it's a huge enterprise. I mean, the other piece to the assumption is that everyone is remaining silent here. I mean, silence plays a huge role in the story, doesn't it?
Yes, silence. I mean, silence to me is the flip side. Silence and fear often go hand in hand. Silence when voice would be appropriate is a shame. Right? And yet it is far more common, I think, than most people realize. And why is that? It's because we can't see the thought bubbles. If I'm holding back with an idea or a concern, you can't tell. You see the silence and your brain will naturally code the silence as I don't have anything to say. It's a natural and spontaneous conclusion. And it's dangerous. Silence kills, silence is dangerous. And silence is, because it's not always life and death, but silence is often just lost value. The good ideas that didn't get shared because I wasn't sure they would be, approved of by the boss or welcomed by the boss.
Well, and it also has a corrosive impact on the individual remaining silent over time as well, doesn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, if I am not offering what I have to offer, I start to feel more disengaged. And the more disengaged I feel, the less I'm happy, the less I'm fully working hard, and the more likely I am ultimately to leave.
Yeah. So I mean, and you touched on the Volkswagen one, but there's a great example of the Wells Fargo. You also talk about Nokia as well. I mean, are there any environments where, I mean, you touched on it earlier on. I mean, are there some business environments today that or some well-known companies that actually where they don't need this safety? I mean, I'm thinking of a kind of a distribution center for Amazon, for instance.
Right,
I mean, are there places where it's still okay to behave in the to not embrace this philosophy?
Let me put it this way: there's a spectrum of how able you are to get away with leading through fear and intimidation. And it's directly correlated with how well understood, transparent, and objectively assessed the work outputs are.
Okay.
And so, for example, an Amazon warehouse or an automotive assembly line, you can tell fairly objectively whether people are doing what you wanted them to do.
Yep.
And a lot of that work can be seen as quite individualistic. There's not a lot of reciprocal back and forth for us to figure out, what good looks like, as there might be, in creating a brilliant animated film, right? We're going to have a lot of back and forth. But so anytime the work is very individually accomplished and very transparently assessed, you increase the chances that you can get away with sort of fear and intimidation as a viable management strategy. And yet, I still think you're going to be leaving value on the table even there.
Yes.
When people's hearts aren't in it, when people don't feel valued by the organization, when they aren't likely to pour their heart and soul into the work and their colleagues' well-being, you're going to lose opportunities at the very least for continuous improvement, for Kaizen, for, if we just went about this a slightly different way, we could shave seconds off that task. Might not seem like a lot, but it adds up to a lot in high volume operations.
Yeah.
So, when you're not treating people as human beings who have something to offer, I think the odds are pretty good you're losing something. It just won't be as radically lost or as obviously lost in highly creative innovation settings.
Yep. So let's switch into the more positive side of the conversation now. I mean, what does good look like? And I mean, maybe I mentioned earlier on, there are three which I'm really interested in talking about. The first is the Eileen Fisher fashion company, which I don't know whether they're in Europe. I think it's a US company, right?
It is a U.S. company. I believe their sales are over, are global, but I'm not 100% sure. And it's not a large company, but it is a very successful fashion company that was started by, an introvert, a woman who, objectively speaking, you would not have expected her to be, a phenomenal business success because she was so introverted and experienced many early failures in trying to get her line picked up in some of the big department stores, but ultimately prevailed. And in part because the clothing is truly different. It appeals to, it's very comfortable and sort of, artistic or different. And it's a line that appeals to many people. And so it has a following, it has a customer following. And Eileen Fisher has very deliberately, and not through going to management training programs, but through, I think, following her own instinct, created a culture shaped a lot by her, by the top. She has a phrase, be a don't knower, right? So she's extremely willing, by temperament or logic, I don't know, to say, well, I don't know, and to kind of create that environment where it's absolutely clear to everyone around her, and really everyone in the company, that their ideas are welcome, that their concerns are welcomed. And so they engage in rituals and processes that make it easier for people to be heard and to listen to each other.
And one of them we mentioned earlier on, as a former anthropologist, I mean, the talking circle, right down to handing I think a gourd or some kind of talking stick from person to person to let everyone's voice be heard in the creative or the co-creative discussions, right?
Right, and it's what that does. So imagine, it seems kind of hokey to pass around a gourd or a stick or something else, but it is a phenomenal device to help us with our human instincts. Because, my human instinct is when you're talking, there's two instincts that are counterproductive. One is I want to chime in, and it's meant in the most supportive and helpful way, but I want to chime in and say, oh yeah, me too. And I've had that, but what about, right? So I'm trying, in a sense, I want to be helpful, but I want to chime in and I interrupt you. The other human instinct is, as I'm listening to you, what am I really doing? I'm thinking through my points.
Yes.
I'm thinking through the argument I'm going to make, but the object that you hold is just this stark reminder that it's your turn. And so I keep catching myself, and it helps me discipline myself to just listen. I look at that, I look at you speaking, I look at that object, and I say, my job is to listen and listen intently.
Interesting. And if you've got, if you're trying to tap into the diversity, the cognitive diversity in the group, as opposed to the sort of biological diversity, then this is a very powerful methodology as well.
It really is, because diversity comes in many forms, some of them visible through demographic differences, and some of them not at all visible through, first of all, expertise, but then even more deeply, just past experiences and what I've seen and what ideas I might come up with. And without, or at least I would argue that there's great value in accessing that diversity. And instinctively, people will, you said something that's different from my original thought. So my instinct is going to be to hold back because I'm not sure. Maybe I'm wrong, or maybe it won't be welcomed. So I hold back. But if we explicitly recognize that diversity of thought is a source of value, then we're going to go after it. It's like a treasure hunt. who's got the treasure.
Yeah.
I don't know who has that great new idea for the new line of fashion or the new color or whatever it is, but I know someone's got it.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, this is it's a very it's a unique process that they use, but what they're beyond the process, this is creating this culture of psychological safety, and there are lots of other ways of doing that, I guess, to tap into this expertise and to encourage people to sort of unload their knowledge in service of solving the problem at hand.
Right, and part of it is just continually reminding people that the problem at hand is hard. Right, it's meant to it's challenging, so it's going to take all we've got.
Yeah,
because I think there's a sort of taken for granted assumption that the workplace is one where we're applying formulae that we've had for years, or that our job is just to execute. Bosses have the answers. We show up, we execute. I mean, we don't think about that consciously that way because it's obviously absurd, but it's sort of it's the old programming.
Mm-hmm.
Boss has answers, we execute. And so why would I speak up? Why would I step out? Why would I take any interpersonal risks?
Interesting. Yeah, yeah. Then the other example I was keen to talk about was the Anglo American example of trying to overcome labor disputes in South Africa. Fascinated just to hear your description of that, because again, there's another anthropological element here which I'd just like to sort of tap into, I guess.
Yes. It's an extraordinary story because it starts with a new CEO coming into Anglo American, Cynthia Carroll, who is the first woman CEO. And it's striking in the history of the company. It's also striking in the industry. That's not a typical expectation.
This is Extractive Industries. It's a mining company for those
the mining industry, and certainly the mining industry in South Africa, a long and unfortunately, dangerous. It's a very dangerous occupation. And this was a company with a high level, as most companies in the industry had, a high level of worker safety issues, including many deaths. And so when Carroll took over, so the first surprise is that this is a very unusual choice for the CEO. The second, and arguably far more surprising surprise, was that she decided to make as her sort of number one priority reducing worker safety issues, reducing deaths, reducing harm to the employees, which people found strange in one obvious way, which is that can't be your first. Your first priority is to make money. Your first priority is the product, is the profit. That might be a sort of nice to have, but no, she put that front and center. And the second reason they found it strange and unexpected is that this was just considered a given that this is a very dangerous workplace. It's dangerous work, and like it or not, people will get hurt. And related to that is the main reason people get hurt is that the workers are just, they can't be trusted to follow safety protocols or wear safety equipment. It's kind of, so the issue of worker lack of safety was taken as just par for the course, as a given. And if you did want to attribute blame, you didn't attribute it to management, you attribute it to the employees themselves for not doing what they were supposed to do to stay safe. So Carroll, I think, was strongly advised against sort of pursuing this, but she stuck to it and insisted that this was what they were going to do. And in fact, took the extraordinarily bold move of shutting the mine down. And that's, you can readily recognize that's money just not flowing in for days. Shut the mine down and brought the workers together to discuss in a sort of a stadium-like environment, because there's many of them, to discuss this issue. Now, at first, the workers they've lived in a climate of fear for generations. They don't actually believe or trust that management actually wants to hear from them. They know they're blamed for safety issues, so they're not really quite willing to speak up about that. So she asked them and organized, just a structured process in smaller groups and larger groups to talk about what they saw and what the work environment was like. And slowly but surely, they started talking about what they saw. And out of that dialogue came ideas for making the work safer as well.
And this dialogue, I think, was based on a way of tribal council methodology from that part of the world, right?
Exactly. So it's such an important thing, because if you're going to engage people in a new kind of conversation, it's got to resonate with something in their own culture, in their own history. that makes sense. It can't be some new, idea from management that says this is what we're going to do now. So it resonated deeply because it did have that place in the tribal history of the region.
Yeah.
It started to unlock, ideas and, commitment, I think almost more than anything to each other, that the employees could recognize their responsibility to themselves, to their families, and to their colleagues to find ways to work more safely.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's a good example because it's psychological safety and it's physical safety as well, all bundled up. So let's get back to something we touched on a few minutes ago earlier on, Amy, about what can, a leader listening to this at the moment, let's say someone with 20 people reporting to them, maybe the leader themselves are feeling unsafe psychologically, but also relies on their team to bring ideas, to bring creative solutions, to engage 100%. But what can they do? What are the things that what's creating organizational safety 101 actually look like?
I think the scenario you're describing is a leader, not the CEO, right, but a leader with people reporting to him or her and feeling maybe unsafe looking up. And and yet also so responsible for people who report to him, say. And so there is this absolute human instinct that, at least in every organization I've been in, that people have, which is to look up. They get intrigued by these ideas. There's something appealing. They understand that we're in knowledge-intensive work, and they absolutely know they want people's full brain in the game. And yet, their first instinct is to say, they won't let us. Right, pointing upward, looking upward, saying they don't do this. And my response back is forget about them for the moment. Just look down. I mean, think about the opportunity you have, to create you could think of it as a bubble. You could think of it as a kind of a safe container for the work that you lead. And it's utterly doable, right? Because in some sense, your job, that leader's job, is to buffer his or her people from whatever the forces up there might be. And your job is always to buffer anyway, because you don't want there are things that people at the top have to worry about, think about, that would be a distraction from simply doing great work on the project, the work that we do. So how do you do that? So I think, it starts with essentially the first and most important job any leader has is to create the rationale. Because you're trying to help people overcome human instinct. The instinct to agree with the boss, the instinct to stay safe, to hold back, to remain silent unless you're really confident what you have to say will be welcomed. So you have to do a good job of describing that rationale. And sometimes that means just referring back to the term you used at the beginning of our conversation, the VUCA. Well, you've got to be the person who reminds people of what we're up against. We're up against volatility, uncertainty, complexity. Whoa, what does that mean? Well, it means that things will go wrong. The only question is how quickly will we be able to kind of react and do something productive instead. So if I'm reminding you, whether I'm running a hospital department or a new product development team, I'm reminding people all the time of sort of what's at stake and why excellence requires all of us. I'm in a sense I'm setting the rational foundation, the case for voice.
Yep.
And then the second thing, because I can set, you get it, I get it. We're on the same page about what we're up against, and you still may be holding back. So that's why I say I've got to go even further and be proactive in inviting you into the conversation. I've got to say, Mark, what's on your mind? Or what have you seen out there that might inform this decision, this particular decision? So I'm asking good questions, and a good question is the kind where I actually don't know the answer.
Yeah. I'm
genuinely curious, or at least I'm going to force myself to be genuinely curious to hear, and it helps you or us focus on something that matters and gives you room to respond.
Yeah. I've got Hal Gregerson coming on the program tomorrow, actually, as it happens.
Perfect.
So, with his new book, The Questions Are the Answers. So, okay, so asking the good questions and then I suppose listening as well, right? I mean, intense listening.
The response of the leader is absolutely critical. And response it starts with listening. I shouldn't be checking my watch or looking at my cell phone when you're speaking. I should look interested. I should be interested. And then beyond listening, how do I respond? I think there has to be a modicum of appreciation in that response. Even if it's just nothing more complicated than thank you for that idea. I don't want to go in that direction, but I so appreciate the idea, right? But thank you so much for that clear line of sight. It's never fun to report bad news to the boss. So we got to make it fun, right? We got to make it, we are not fun. We don't make it fun, but we do have to make it at least tolerable.
Yep. Okay. So there's the kind of setting the stage, then, as you say, inviting this participation into the,
right.
And then the final piece.
The final piece is responding appreciatively.
Okay.
Right. So I'm listening and then I'm responding in a way, and a productive response could be as simple as thank you, for that clear line of sight, or as, large as, okay, wow, let's form a task force to get on, what do you need? Who do you need? What resources do you need to address this? Right. So, it can be a viable response to realize, we've got an interesting challenge here. Let's roll up our sleeves and work on it together.
As you talk, one of the things that goes through, I remember talking to a CEO who said, we don't do failure here. And this is an R&D company, believe it or not. Which you go onto their website and it's all about innovation and stuff. And I was kind of lost for an answer to that. But in your book, you have this lovely typology of different types of failure.
Yeah,
which would have been very helpful had I had that to hand a couple of years ago. But obviously, it was
yes, exactly. Because so failure comes in at least 3 types. And one type is preventable failure. And those we should try to prevent. We should do everything we can through communication, training, support to prevent preventable failures. And those are the ones where we actually do have a process or a protocol or resources to achieve the result we want. And for some reason, we fail. Someone didn't wear their safety glasses or someone didn't follow the protocol. We figure out why and we help, but we don't celebrate that. We don't say, wow, how wonderful a failure. The second kind are the complex kind, where despite fairly mature knowledge about how to get some result, we also have uncertainty or customization or variability of some kind that will often lead to an unexpected confluence of factors and a failure. Those still are not good news. And yet, again, your primary job is to learn from them. But the third kind of failures, which I call intelligent failures, are legitimately and genuinely good news. They are the still undesired, unwanted result of a novel experiment, a novel foray into new territory. We go somewhere in a scientific experiment or a product experiment that no one's ever done before. And those we have to learn to actually celebrate and, and welcome. And in fact, have them as often as possible, because that's where new ideas come from. That's where tomorrow's revenues and profits come from.
Yep.
And so oftentimes, when leaders say things like, we can't have failure here, or failure is not an option, it doesn't change nature. It doesn't change human nature either. It doesn't make failure go away. It just drives it underground.
Yeah. And a couple of companies you touched on in the book, Google X, and also Bridgewater, they seem to be, they hunt out failures and they hunt out those third category and do a lot of work on making sure they learn from those so they're not repeated, essentially.
They have awards. They'll have some companies will have wonderful rituals like, the Failure of the Month award. And again, those will all be intelligent failures. They won't be stupid mistakes. They'll be intelligent failures, and they celebrate them. Why? Well, it continues to reinforce the climate where people know, we're in the innovation business in a VUCA world. We better be failing. If we're not, it's like never falling on the ski slope. You're not taking any risks.
You're not trying hard enough. Yeah, absolutely.
You got to be out there. You got to be. You can't just be engaging in safe experiments. Because the competitors are going to be doing the wild-eyed stuff, and they'll ultimately steal your customers because they have better ideas and exciting new things.
Yeah. So wonderful. Amy, before we go to the 3 questions I sent, just a quick, the book has just launched. I presume this is resonating, in the marketplace. Are you surprised by the response you got, or is it premature at this point?
Well, it's just the book, I think, comes out officially tomorrow.
Okay.
But what I am surprised by and gratified by is that psychological safety has been getting a lot of attention recently. right? It's just resonating. I think it's resonating because of the era in which we live, because more and more people are recognizing that this really is a new world, right? This is not your grandfather's automotive company. This is a world where human beings genuinely are our most valuable resources. We want their hearts and minds. And so that's resonating, and people are realizing that the fear doesn't work very well. And I have to say, this recognition got a big boost from Google, the well-publicized study that they did internally to try to understand, well, what explains the difference between high-performing teams and lower-performing teams. And there, after a great deal of work, a great deal of data analysis, the resounding response was psychological safety. That got a lot of attention. And so more and more people started talking about Google's idea of psychological safety. That's when I thought, I better write this book. It's overdue. It's overdue anyway, but I better write this book. So, I mean, I guess I'm a little surprised, but also very gratified that people are talking about this topic, because I think it's, more than just business performance, which I certainly care about. I care very deeply about what the workplace is like. If you think about how many of the waking hours of most people around the world are spent at work, that better be a place where you can show up unafraid and feel that your voice is welcome, and that you really can contribute to something larger than yourself. I don't think you can do that when it's a fear-based culture.
Yeah. And I'm curious, the language, fear is you talk about the fearless organization. I'm just wondering, words are very, very important. And I can't think of a better word to use, but, it's a negative word, fearless. So there's less negativity. Did you wrestle with that? Because you could call it an enabling word, but that's a bit dull. But I'm just interested in the choice of words there.
It's such a tricky thing, because psychological safety is a term in the academic literature, and I think people understand what it means. But because that could have been the title, right? A psychologically safe organization. But the problem is, I think people instantly hear an implication of cozy and nice and maybe even polite. And of course, that's not what I mean at all. What I mean is candid and clear and willing to have tough conversations. So the problem was, I can't change the academic term and the long literature on it to be something else. But I wanted to convey quickly what I meant before I had more time in the pages that follow to explain more clearly what I meant. So to convey quickly, I wanted to say, fearless, right? It makes you sit up straight just to think about it. And yet, of course, I don't mean there's going to be no fear. What I mean is, we're not going to be afraid of each other.
Yes. Yeah.
Fine to be afraid of the competition. It's fine to be afraid of the, massive challenges that lie ahead in our marketplace. It's not helpful to be afraid of the boss.
Yeah.
So it was the best shorthand I could come up with. And I know it's a bit, it's not going to be, it isn't negative, and it is probably an extreme statement.
Yeah. But as you say, there are a few options, and it's also, it's grounded in the literature, and yeah. So the three questions I sent across, which I think you admitted to being a little bit tricky, so let's go for it. What have you changed your mind about recently, Amy?
What I have recently changed my mind about was a long-standing belief, maybe even conviction, that it was wrong or unnecessary to self-publicize. So I worked right out of college. I worked for Buckminster Fuller, who was a great inventor, architect, futurist. He thought a lot about very big questions. How do we make a better world? How do we make sure spaceship Earth functions for everyone? So I worked for Bucky as his engineer, designing new structures, and he had a religious conviction about he was not allowed to self-publicize. The only thing he could do was say what he thought, and if people were interested, they'd read his books, they'd invite him to speak, and so on. And so the idea was, good ideas speak for themselves. You don't need to be proactively out there pushing them. I had tried to adhere to that, the spirit and the intent of that. Like, good ideas ought to speak for themselves. You shouldn't have to publicize them. In the era of social media, and maybe just it was a naive idea in the first place, I've come around to the idea that it's okay for me to try to sell these ideas, to try to sell books, to be a bit more proactive, and even to ask for help in that.
Yeah. I think it is okay. It's it's a tough world out there. A lot of books out there, and it's
crowded.
Well, yeah, crowded, but also, I mean, if you believe, I mean, when you use the word sell, I sensed you felt something a little bit sort of, vulgar or dirty about it. But
right. But it's not.
It's not.
The best kind of selling is, how do I help you
absolutely
solve a problem that you have? And I really believe that. I'm not trying to pull the wool over your eyes. I'm trying to be helpful.
It's a transfer of enthusiasm.
Exactly. Oh, I love that. That's right. I'm enthusiastic about this, so I hope you are too.
I can tell you are, exactly. So so I've liberated you from from having to sell. Yeah. So the second question, where do you go to get fresh perspectives to stay innovative and creative?
Well, books, of course, right? I mean, I love books and articles. I mean, I love reading, and certainly reading about things that happened recently or long ago are both sources of great freshness and new perspective. So, for example, we were talking about worker safety in the mining industry with Cynthia Carroll and Anglo American. This summer, I read a book called The Radium Girls that absolutely blew me away. And it was the story, because it's such an extreme case of worker unsafety. Mm-hmm. And it's the story of the girls, and they were young teenagers who worked in the radium dial industry, the watch industry. And they were told they had to paint the little radium, which is radioactive definition, onto the watch dials. And they had these little tiny paintbrushes, and the only real way to make the work clear enough to
I know what you're going to say.
Was to use their tongue. And a great many, really the majority of them, ended up with horrifying cancers, and they lost their jaws and everything. And the company went to great lengths to try to deny any responsibility for this, even though there was a great deal of knowledge about how deadly this material was. These were, by and large, young women, poor young women. Mm. So the book was extraordinarily beautifully written, and it led to the creation of OSHA. Right, so really? Sort of like it literally was the case that ultimately, and it took years to fight for the responsibility of the company and to help these women, because none of them had any money. There was obviously no available healthcare back then. Mm-hmm. So it's a beautiful story that just shows like what you can do when you look into history to find out things about the workplace, that some of which resonate today, and some of which obviously don't. So I did come away from it thinking, first of all, okay, we have come a long way, right? As challenging as some of the stories I've written about the book are, nothing like 100 years ago, what people put up with in the workplace. Yep. It also gave me a sense of just great admiration and a desire. I'd already finished this book, but a desire to bring more of the personal stories into
your work,
my writing and work going forward, because these are just extraordinarily gripping and engaging stories.
Lovely. Well, we'll put it in the show notes, and I'll add it to my shopping list. Final question: what's been your most significant failure or low? What have you learned from it, and how have you applied that learning, Amy?
This is such a tricky one. I mean, failure and low are two different things. I guess maybe the one that I finally think, here's the one that comes to mind. When I finished my PhD, and I had this accidental discovery of psychological safety, and then my dissertation was a well-designed study that showed far more conclusively that psychological safety varies from group to group in an organization, and that it predicts learning and performance. Mm-hmm. And so I was done. I was going to graduate. I was excited. Now I needed a job. And of course, I wanted very much to get a job in my field of organizational behavior. And my husband, who's a scientist, had just started a new lab down the road at MIT. So I really was quite constrained. I had to find a local job. So I applied to the organizational behavior unit at Harvard Business School and some other local schools as well. And to my dismay, not surprise, but dismay, I didn't get hired. Mm-hmm. I not only didn't get hired by the organizational behavior group, and I understand not being first choice. There are many strong candidates out there, but they hired an unprecedented 3 faculty members that year. And so I wasn't first choice. I get that. I wasn't second choice. I wasn't third choice. And they told me that they said, we don't think your work is interesting. We don't think it will go anywhere. So it felt terrible. But unbeknownst to them, there was a funny little group at the school called Technology and Operations Management who had heard about what I had done, and maybe in part because it was in factory settings. They were very eager to hire someone who, this is their term, not mine, was a behavioral scientist who wasn't afraid of technology. They just thought it would be fun to have someone in their group who knew about people. So they essentially asked me to compete for a job. They hired me, a great surprise. But the not being hired in my own field did leave me feeling quite insecure about whether my ideas would be taken up and would be published, and whether, in fact, I'd ultimately be able to survive at all as an academic. And I felt quite low about it, and it forced me to kind of work very hard to get the paper, the main paper, published.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So I think it led to hard work. It certainly led me not to feel at all arrogance, the wrong word, but even confident. I was excited about the results of my dissertation, but I wasn't confident.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, and nothing is as powerful as an idea whose time has come. But I mean, by the same token, something a little bit premature, right? It can be the best idea on the planet, but if people aren't ready for it.
Yeah. I mean, when the Google study was published in the New York Times, cover story of the magazine by Charles Duhigg in February of 2016, I was pretty excited because it actually, in the online version, it linked through to my original published paper in 1999. And then I did the math, and I thought about that. That is a 17-year, lag from published academic article to, mainstream recognition. It's a long way.
Yeah, but I mean, if let's you wrote about exponential technologies a little bit, so apply the exponential curve over the next 5 years, and I mean, you'll be, who knows where this could go, right?
Right. What I would hope is it would go to where most managers recognize that this is indeed one of their responsibilities, is to create a psychologically safe workplace.
Yeah, absolutely. Super. Amy, this has been fantastic. Where can people, I mean, I'm giving you an opportunity now to sell yourself. Where can people get in touch with you if they're interested in following your work? And I will put that in the show notes.
You can find me at hbs.edu. Just search Amy Edmondson. I have a faculty page there. And of course, the book is coming out tomorrow, November 20th. It's already available, but on Amazon or wherever else you like to buy your books. And I hope that people will read it and find just a few tips and tools they can put to use at work.
And you're on LinkedIn and
Oh, yes. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on Twitter, Amy C. Edmondson. But LinkedIn is probably a good place to find me.
Okay, we'll put all those in the show notes. But many thanks for your time, and very much enjoyed our conversation. And have a great day, Amy.
You too. Thank you, Mark.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Bye.
I often say in life that you're either a warning or you're an example. And Amy gives us some very powerful warnings of what happens if you're unable to create cultures of characterized by psychological safety in the forms of Volkswagen or Wells Fargo or Nokia. And she also gives us some really fascinating and compelling examples from the worlds of fashion and technology and mining. And as an anthropologist, you're not going to be surprised that I really like the way she described how business leaders were able to tap into the cultures and traditions of their indigenous populations in South Africa with Anglo American, and in with the Native American Tribal Council with Eileen Fisher's company, to solve 21st century challenges. And this is a theme we're going to be coming back to in the future, I've got no doubt. My final thought is around Amy's answer to the question, what has she changed her mind about recently? And you'll remember, she no longer sees self-publicity as something that is salesy and unnecessary if your ideas are strong and compelling. Indeed, in today's noisy and cluttered world, it's really hard to separate out the signal from the noise. Now, Amy's work for me is all signal, and I'm really pleased to help her get her message out, as it's so fundamental for leaders in this VUCA world. And let me make a request of you too. There are lots of podcasts out there, and I'm hugely grateful that you've got this far. So please help me by getting my work further out into the world, into your organizations and into your networks, however you see fit. I hope you've enjoyed this podcast. Let me know your thoughts. I'm on LinkedIn and I'm on Twitter. And until next time, have a great week. This is Mark Bidwell, changing perspectives, one podcast at a time.